epistemological challenge um, that Gobbo identifies in work seeking to reconcile Scriabin's music with his thought. Finally, this assessment of Solovyov's influence on Scriabin enables us to situate the composer within two utopias to refer to this conference's theme. The erotic utopia identified in Russian modernism by Olga Matic, and a proto-Stalinist utopia based on Boris Groys's thesis in The Total Art of Stalinism, which I believe has been neglected by musicologists. I will begin by summarizing the key aspects of Vladimir Solovyov's religious metaphysics as it is expressed in the lectures on divine humanity and the meaning of love. Solovyov delivered his 12 lectures on divine humanity, or lectures on godmanhood, from 1878 to 1881. The meaning of love was written between 1892 and 1894 and deals specifically with the role of sexual love in the metaphysics he introduced with the lectures. I only offer a rudimentary outline of his metaphysics, just the necessary aspects to understand what Scriabin draws from him. In the lectures, Solovyov argues that the absolute principle, or God, is immanent in the material world, infusing every atom but reaching greater concentrations in so-called higher forms of matter. For Solovyov, humanity is that highest form, the most important step in a teleology that interprets all cosmic history as a gradual reconciliation of divinity and materiality. For him, just as a series of physical changes, or formations, as he calls them, created organic matter from inorganic matter, and humans from organic matter, a series of spiritual changes created Christianity from Judaism, and Judaism from paganism. And among those Christians, certain humans experience mystical revelations that enable humanity in general to realize the presence of the divine absolute within their material individualities. Such individuals have achieved godmanhood, not to be confused with Nietzsche's man-god. Notably, Solovyov views creativity and poetry as a central medium for realizing the divine within oneself and sharing it with others. Edith Clowes describes this process as his way of, quote, thinking out total unity, end quote, which includes pervasive use of oxymoron and a desire to yoke together what would seem to be unyokable. Central to this process is the Gnostic concept syzygy. Clowes writes that for Solovyov, quote, syzygy suggests a conjoining at once of psychological, physiological, physical, social, and mystical spiritual forces in the name of love and total unity, end quote. In an astrophysical sense, the term refers to when a celestial body is in opposition to or conjunction with another body. In biological terms, it refers to meiosis, or the pairing of chromosomes from the sperm and egg in sexual reproduction. Solovyov exploits the varied meaning of the word, setting out to demonstrate how all these forces are bound together in a way that is more than metaphorical. Solovyov argues that what is in common in all syzygial processes is love, which emerges in his discussion of Sophia in the 7th lecture. Here, he advances his interpretation of Sophia as divine wisdom and world soul. She is, quote, God's body, the matter of divinity, permeated with the principles of divine unity. Actualizing in himself or bearing this unity, Christ, as the integral divine organism, both universal and individual, is both Logos and Sophia, end quote. For Solovyov, Sophia represents the body of Christ, while God represents his divinity. In the meaning of love, Solovyov maps this dynamic of materiality and divinity, or Sophia and God, onto the sexual relationship between men and women, and pursues the sexual valences of syzygy. In this text, he defines love as, quote, the justification and salvation of individuality through the sacrifice of egoism, end quote, or more fundamentally, the recognition of the other. Solovyov argues that among forms of love, this occurs paradigmatically in sexual love, since this is where two individualized material bodies partake in the absolute principle of love, while also uniting man taken to represent divinity and woman taken to represent materiality. For him, the sexual act therefore momentarily enacts the divine union of God and Sophia, which began and will end the universe. All these themes manifest in Scriabin's output, most notably a metaphysics of sexual love. I also believe Solovyov's syzygal thinking presents a way of dealing with the epistemological challenge Godboy identifies, to which I referred to earlier. Instead of viewing his music and philosophy as self-contained discrete bodies that must be brought together in a sense, I advocate viewing his output as a music philosophy that is best elucidated in terms of syzygy. This means searching for a vector that operates transversely across traditional conceptual and disciplinary boundaries. It is a vector that would affect parallel abstract movements in Scriabin's music, thought, and life. In these ways, syzygy is not unlike an abstract machine in the sense of Deleuze and Guattari, a way of thinking in terms of metonymy rather than metaphor across the social field. Throughout his life, Scriabin surrounded himself with many of Solovyov's followers. According to his friend and brother-in-law Boris de Schlosser, Scriabin was an avid reader of Solovyov's works and regularly attended meetings of the Moscow Religious Philosophical Society, founded in honor of Solovyov. Scriabin kept close friendships with the scholars Sergei Trubetskoy and Vyacheslav Ivanov, whose philosophical projects were essentially continuations of Solovyov's thought. The composer also maintained a salon at his Moscow flat after his final return to Russia in 1909, where he met frequently with sophiologists like Pavel Florensky and Nikolai Berdyaev. In 1920, 3 years after the composer's death, or 5 years I should say, another Solovyov acolyte, Alexei Losev, penned an essay on the composer entitled Scriabin's Worldview. Florensky even reportedly told Leonid Sabanev at the composer's funeral in 1915 that he thought his mysterium would be realized in 33 years. Evidently, Solovyov's followers took great interest in the composer, suggesting a deep correspondence between their ideas. An incomplete libretto for an abandoned opera, written sometime between 1900 and 1903, evokes sophiological themes. The plot of the opera is unclear, but the following lines from a dance song demonstrate a conflation of sexual and astrophysical imagery motivated by metaphysical love and a teleology towards the divine, all of which is characteristic of Solovyov's syzygal thinking. He says, "I am the apotheosis of the universe. I am the aim of aims, the end of ends. With the strength of daring thought, long ago I took possession of the world. I should like to impress my love upon the hearts of people." And he continues, "By the strength of the spells of heavenly harmony, I will waft caressing dreams to people, and by the power of love, immeasurable and marvelous, I will make their life a likeness of spring. I will grant them the peace they have long yearned for by the strength of my own wisdom." Continuing the syzygal device that unites the material, musical, and metaphysical, Scriabin insists upon the power of his art to enact love and elevates himself to an apotheosis of the universe, basically presenting himself as the endpoint of Solovyov's teleology. Further on in the dance song, this love is presented in more sexual terms. He writes, "Beloved, beautiful world, I surrender to you with bliss, and all nakedness of spirit become intoxicated with me. You will arrive captivatingly, like an image of beautiful truth, like the charm of a caress, a sparkling flood of wonders, gushing onto the earth from the heavens." Scriabin nonetheless saves his depiction of sexual love from becoming hedonism by describing it as a, quote, "image of beautiful truth," end quote, a defining feature of Platonic eros on which Solovyov's sexual love is based. In his more solipsistic writings from 1905 to 1906, Scriabin expounds on the nature of that highest individuality who has made itself synonymous with global consciousness. This personality, quote, "will turn the universe into a divine organism. This will be the achievement of full harmony, the limit of the upsurge of creation. It will be ecstasy. The world will give itself to that personality as a woman does to a lover," end quote. In this passage, he defines music, love, the end of history, and the formation of the collective by the same process, in effect, a syzygy. At the end of history, the world, represented by the lover, or Solovyov's Sophia, becomes the material pair to the composer's divinity, enacted in an ecstatic sexual union. Scriabin expounds further on what happens when that woman gives herself to a lover, writing, quote, "As a person during the sexual act loses consciousness at the moment of ecstasy, and his whole organism at every point experiences bliss, so also God as a person, experiencing ecstasy, will fill the universe with bliss and will ignite fire," end quote. This quote just about sums up Solovyov's theories of godmanhood and sexual love. This passage also brings us to Scriabin's infamous proclamation, "I am God." Seldom discussed, though, is the assertion with which he usually follows this, "I am nothing." This seeming paradox can be viewed as an oscillation between the composer's focus on the divinity and materiality within himself. as both an individual and an absolute being at the end point of Solovyov's cosmic teleology. He has, supposedly like Christ, reconciled his divine and human natures, the all and the nothing. Earlier, we saw Scriabin describe the end of history as a, quote, achievement of full harmony, end quote, and love is a process that conveys, quote, the spells of heavenly harmony. This motivates me now to look at how these ideas are enacted and extended in his music. In this last section, I extend Susana Garcia's readings of the late sonatas as narratives of Dionysian ecstasy by introducing an enactive component to this narrative and insisting on the central rather than peripheral role of Solovyov's metaphysics in guiding the music. So I'll offer a brief glimpse of how this synthesis looks in sophiological terms in the 9th and 10th sonatas. 3 of the late sonatas, 6, 7, and 9, provide a fitting vessel for Solovyov's metaphysics of sexual love because they demonstrate a rigid gender binary, a subservience of the feminine encoded element to the masculine encoded one, and a drive to synthesize the two, all of which characterize Solovyov's heteropatriarchal thought. Scriabin makes explicit the implicit gender dynamics of sonata form identified by Marcia Citron with his characteristic performance indications attached to the themes. Masculine encoded themes are labeled with terms like mysterious, legendary, with the dark majesty, and imperious. They are downbeat oriented and feature bells or summons-like motives that signify a call to action. The feminine encoded ones are labeled with terms like clarity, sweetness, purity, charming, with the celestial voluptuousness, pure, with the growing languor. These melodies usually have soft dynamics, eschew downbeats, are more legato, and feature a lot of side gestures. The music in these sonatas develops mainly by means of rote transcription with little alteration of melodic contour, which preserves the identity of these themes' semiotic and gender content. Climactic moments usually feature both themes played simultaneously or identifiable fragments played in quick succession. In some, emphasis in these sonatas, I believe, is not on the development of the themes per se, but the process by which they are synthesized, which is also Solovyov's focus. As an example, let us turn to the 9th sonata. The primary masculine encoded theme, marked légendaire, features a chromatically descending line that echoes at the tritone. The feminine encoded theme features the sensual melody marked with a growing languor. In the development, the feminine encoded theme is shrouded in different accompanimental figurations, punctuated by occasional protests of the masculine encoded theme, though the contour of either is rarely, if ever, altered. The feminine encoded theme is recapitulated in the form of a macabre march, which cuts off its usual cadential flourish and replaces it with an oscillation between a perfect fourth, an interval closely associated with this theme. This change of identity of the second theme facilitates the contrapuntal stacking of the two themes. In this example, the first theme materializes underneath a statement of the second theme in octaves. Finally, in the climactic moment of measures 191 and 192, both themes are played simultaneously and in the same hand, the first and only time both these things occur. This is the moment of divine union, not only where the masculine and feminine encoded themes are united, but where both are united under the same hand. Here, I recall Kenneth Smith's description of the 4th sonata as a, quote, erotic discourse of the hands, end quote. The melodic synthesis is extended by a corporeal synthesis, both participating in the same syzygy. Perhaps the most evocative demonstration of syzygy is in the 10th sonata, nicknamed the Trill Sonata. Compared to sonatas 6, 7, and 9, this one is unusual since there are 3 themes rather than 2, and they are all feminine encoded stylistically and in the expressive markings. I believe the gender dynamics of the sonata are better traced in its enactment of vibration rather than in the semiotic content of the themes. In his notebooks, Scriabin describes vibration as a means of relating between successive states of consciousness, but also between separate consciousnesses. He writes, "The upsurge of this struggle defines the qualitative content of the state I am experiencing, such as of different colors, as of a different quantity of vibrations in a unit of time. Things are distinguished from each other according to the upsurge of the activity, so to speak. by the quantity of vibrations in a unit of time. Every given moment in history is a negation of the whole of the past of humanity. The struggle he is referring to here is one between his consciousness and those of the other within him. For Scriabin, vibration facilitates a negation of a previous state of consciousness, a process always associated with the greater upsurge of activity. The final state of consciousness, of course, is ecstasy. This account of vibration guides my residual analysis of Scriabin's wrist movements in the 10th Sonata. In this piece, what begins as a nervous impulse produced by the consciousness of the composer, a wrist oscillation attached to a neighboring figure, circled here, is gradually accelerated and reterritorialized onto ever larger space-times. This neighboring figure accelerates to become trills, which become trills in both hands, furnishing a vibration in the hand's horizontal dimension. Then we encounter repeated chords, furnishing a vibration in the hand's vertical dimension, the hand moving quickly up and down. Finally, at the climax, we find a tremolo spread out between both hands, the wrist vibrating in both dimensions, vertically with the repeated chords, horizontally across the whole body between the arms. This process of increased vibration is supplemented with stylistic markings that describe a proliferation of light, associated in Orthodox theology with the divine wisdom of Sophia. These tremolos then become, with the help of some residual thinking that marshals his writings, a vibration between the composer and audience, enacting in piano solo form Scriabin's desire to annihilate the boundary between performer and audience. In sum, through vibration, the sonata affects a syzygy, the relationship between the extreme ends of the wrist oscillations, between the pianist's hands, between the piano and the pianist, between the performer and the audience, and between the composer and world, eventually expands to encompass a scale that reaches to the stars and culminates in a union between God and Sophia. All these forces work together to produce a single vector of love that enact a union cutting across his music, thought, and life. As I hope to have shown in this paper, Scriabin's music and thought is suffused with Solovyovian themes, and above all, sexual love. By way of conclusion, I would like to suggest how this reading prompts the necessity of placing the composer in the evolution of Russian aesthetico-political dictatorship, as it is narrated by Boris Groys, Bernice Glatzer-Rosenthal, Irina Gutkin, and David Roberts. All these authors demonstrate how aspects of symbolism and avant-gardism were continued, often clandestinely, by the Soviet state. These aspects are, in sum, the desire to unite art and life, dissolve the boundary between reality and potentiality, and usher in a new person, often through the augmentation of corporeal capacities and with the goal of bringing about a kind of end of history. Scriabin worked at these goals in ways arguably more extreme than all of his contemporaries. Alexander Koyev also suggests a way, I believe, of contextualizing Scriabin within this history as a middleman that best captures the epistemological continuity between Solovyov and Stalin. Groys describes Koyev's reading of Hegel as a secularization of Solovyov, writing, quote, "This is why Koyev proclaims himself a Stalinist. Stalinists realized a society of love by abolishing love. In a sense, Stalinist Russia fits the general pattern of post-revolutionary states. The moment of complete satisfaction of philosophical desire, the moment of unification with Sophia, with absolute knowledge, is only a moment. After that moment, this desire, as the specifically human desire, as the desire to be desired, disappears once and for all," end quote. It is doubtful, of course, Stalinism, given its horrors, generally achieved a society in which all recognize each other, at least according to any usual definition of recognition. But as we see in Solovyov, love, more than simply being a type of relationship between humans, is an epistemology that organizes unity and multiplicity from the atomic to the cosmic. In this light, we might view Gottfried Eberle's description of Scriabin's late sonatas as constructed ecstasy, as part of a lineage of seemingly oxymoronic phrases that extends from Solovyov's sexual love to Vladimir Lenin's theories of the professional revolutionary and democratic centralism, to Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, to Stephen Hansen's description of the new Soviet person as planned heroism, to economist Noam Yasny's characterization of the 5-year plans as Bacchanalian planning. All these concepts yoke together seemingly irreconcilable views on temporality, notable for us given the fact, as Rebecca Mitchell argues, in late imperial and early revolutionary Russia, quote, Music became a means of interrogating time itself, end quote. If Scriabin carried to an extreme the symbolist epistemology that Groys argues Stalinism does not repudiate, but takes as the starting point for a total aesthetic reorganization of society, then I believe musicologists are in a position to say something about the political history of the Soviet Union that is inaccessible by other means. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that paper, Alec. That was fantastic. All right, we have time for some questions.
I have a question. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why you chose precisely to put Solovyov in the sort of center of your picture, as opposed to maybe other figures who, I mean, they're kind of hard to classify. George Young has called them religious cosmists. Other figures, like you mentioned, Florensky, who Sabaneyev wrote a long article about, and he was, of course, close to Scriabin. I wonder if you could further talk about why Solovyov is so important to this picture.
Mm-hmm. My decision to go with Solovyov was that I think he presents the broadest conception of what, or the role of sexual love and creativity and in metaphysics in general. But as you say, of course, though, like Florensky and Berdyaev even wrote a book on like the role of the sexual act in creativity. But we have evidence that Solovyov was an avid, Scriabin was an avid reader of Solovyov, and he was Solovyov formed a basis for what a lot of people in Russia in this period were talking about. So it was kind of part of the language of the time. Someone who, if you were a philosophically minded person living in Russia at the time, you would have had to have lived under a rock to not be familiar with what Solovyov was saying. But I do agree. I have not looked as in depth in the writings of Berdyaev, Florensky on their particular ways they extend Solovyov's Sophiological thinking. That there could be more hidden correspondences in there between the ways they extend this thought in their own individual ways.
Alec, thank you so much for your presentation. It was fascinating. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the title of the 10th Sonata, Black Mass, and how that might relate to a union between God and man.
Yeah, that's the title for the 9th Sonata. I think here I should defer to the 7th Sonata because the Black Mass was not given to the piece by Scriabin. It was suggested by a friend of his. I don't remember if it was the publisher or someone else, and he said, "Okay, that's good," because it was a kind of a dark response to the more bright 7th Sonata, which Scriabin himself named the White Mass. I think that piece does evoke the trappings of a divine liturgy because it's replete with bell sounds. It opens with them, and if I recall, bells in Russia generally sound sevenths than octaves. Is that correct? So I think, yeah, all the sevenths you find in that sonata are really in just about all of his late works really call to mind an Orthodox service to me, which could be connected with this discussion of Solovyov because in Orthodox theology, what happens in communion is a kind of reciprocal process between divinity and materiality. When you eat the body and when you take the body and blood of Christ, you are in a sense becoming divine for a moment.
I have a question about sonatas, I think. So one of the most conventional ways of describing sonata form is in terms of gender, right? That we have a sort of masculine encoded theme. We have a feminine encoded second theme. You know, what those terms mean is a little bit nebulous. But that then they are juxtaposed in the recapitulation, and there's some sort of union that happens there. So this, I'm thinking of A.B. Marx from the middle of the 19th century. So I'm wondering, I guess, how much of what Scriabin is doing here in these sonatas just relates to those kind of conventional ideas about how sonatas work, and how much do you think is really kind of inspired by this Solovyovian idea?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, I'd be more inclined to say that, well, there's a comment that Aaron Copland made about Scriabin, is that he supposedly fit this fascinating new body of expression into the straitjacket of sonata form, is what he calls it. But I think Scriabin was probably motivated to continue, or it didn't cause him to continue to use sonata form, but it probably facilitated or motivated him to keep doing it, Solovyov's metaphysics, because the rigid gender binary and the active character Solovyov ascribes to the masculine principle, and the passive one he ascribes to the feminine one, despite this appearance of supposedly completely equal union, it meshes well with the typical way we view the gendered dynamics of sonata form. Although I would say not all result in not all of his late sonatas result in a kind of union that would suggest like I think Citron and McClary describes it as like a taming of the second theme. For example, the sixth sonata, in the recapitulation, it's almost as if several feminine encoded elements are giving free rein to just do whatever, and it's their kind of machinic proliferation that prompts the you don't get closure in the same sense you do in the other ones where the themes are synthesized. So I think there could be room for more careful interpretation by each sonata of what's happening in terms of gender.
Okay, great. Thank you. One last question you have time for? All right, yes, please, Maria.
I'm interested what you think about the idea of number of movements in Scriabin sonatas, and whether you think perhaps rather than sort of the idea that post-Liszt, the one movement sonata was the way to go, this is maybe a more philosophical point, or not.
The questions about why Scriabin
number of movements, because he starts off, of course, doing a standard number of movements from his first sonata with 4 movements, and then after the 3 movement sonatas, he gravitates towards 2 or 1.
Right.
And it's traditionally sort of thought that post-Liszt, the 1 movement sonata is all you need. And I'm wondering whether what you're suggesting is actually, it's really not that much to do with Liszt, but perhaps more the philosophical and literary environment that he's in.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not that familiar with how the argument that comes from Liszt. Where is that discussed?
Oh, just as in the B minor sonata, the having a 1 movement sonata.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked into that particular question that much. I would think that given starting with the 6th sonata, Scriabin develops he's very meticulous about the structure of the sonatas, and this is why Gottfried barely describes them as constructed ecstasy, because he writes out like all the like how many bars the piece is going to have before he puts down a single note. Maybe I would imagine it could be easier for him to convey this narrative he wants to convey with one sonata that structure is carefully delineated so much, and that within that structure is embedded all the steps on the teleology, whether it's a teleology that's some mixture of Solovyov and Blavatsky, probably. I'm not that familiar with Liszt in general and what Scriabin might have taken from him, but I would wager that the literary elements play a substantial role in motivating him to go to 1 movement.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we should move on to our next